Welcome everyone to the second podcast of this series on development banks and the green transition. Uh, Today, the episode is with two great experts, international experts, and also Brazilian expert. Uh, Both of them very well known international experts, by the way. And it's going to be on climate action finance, and to hear from them where we are at and where we're going to. Uh, this is this the podcast Development Banks in Green Transition is part of the project Enhancing Resource Mobilization for Sustainable Investment for Multilateral Development Banks. It's a partnership between SEBRE and the Center for Global Development. And the idea is to look at the reforms of multilateral development banks from the end, from bottom up, from a South perspective, or how these reforms can help national development banks mobilize more resources for climate action. I am Rogério Studer. I'm a senior fellow at the Political Economy Center at SEBRE. I'm a macroeconomist specializing in international finance, and I have a passion for a just transition to a low carbon, more resilient economy. I have the pleasure to have two great international experts here and good friends. They have such a long CV that it's difficult for me not to read them, and I'll do that very quickly, hopefully. Maria Neto served as a financial markets specialist at Inter-American Development Bank and as a head of financial institutions and market divisions at the New Development Bank. At both organizations, she was responsible for overseeing innovative financing strategies, programs with local financial institutions and capital markets to promote private sector investments in low carbon and resilient projects in Latin America and the Caribbean. She has more than 10 years. She also worked for 10 years at the Secretariat of the Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, where she was responsible for leading institutions' work on bilateral and multilateral financial cooperation. She does much more, Maria. I'm sorry, but I'm going to go to say that she holds a master's degree in economics from Geneva Institute of International Development. And let me try to briefly introduce another very long CV. This is what I love about these young ladies here. Dr. Barbara Butler is a Global Managing Director of the Climate Policy Initiative. We all know the work of CPI. We all use your data, and you have introduced evidence-based analysis for a lot of us. She has been named one of the 20 most influential women in climate finance and one of the 100 most influential people in climate policy. Barbara advises leaders on climate, energy, land use investments around the world. She directs the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance. She previously served in the Global Landscape of Climate Finance, which is a report we all read very carefully. She has served as again, I have to wrap up that because otherwise reading both your CVs is going to take another half hour, but I wish we can share the CV with you. All I can say is that for me is a true privilege to be here, not only to know you, but to know the great experts that you are. And I'm very grateful to having you here. The rules of engagement that we discussed, we have three large questions, and this is an informal conversation. I mean, if you want to read about more of the technical work of these incredible two ladies, you can Google them. You probably find thousands of quotes of their work. So thank you very much. Shall we start this podcast now? Okay, let me go to the first question. We all know that transitioning to a more just, a more sustainable world is going to require an enormous amount of transformative investments, and without having the financial sector bringing those funds to this transition, it's going to be impossible to do it. That is particularly true in developing countries where the fiscal constraints are enormous, and where the needs for investments in resilience, but for adaptation, for transition itself are significant. So, where do you think we are now, and where we are heading in terms of the financial sector providing this funding? Let me start with Barbara, and then I'll give the word to Maria.
Great. Thank you so much, Rogerio, and it's a pleasure being here with you all today. And yes, very important questions here, and I might just start with some statistics because I do love data. I'm very much sure that we need to have the right information in order to make the right decisions, and so we at CPI work a lot on just providing the right information. So just where are we today? I think what we have seen in terms of climate finance is that there have been increases over the last years. The most recent average annual climate finance flows that we have been able to track reached almost $1.3 trillion US, which means that they're nearly doubled compared to 4 years ago. And that obviously is good news. But while there was this increase of finance, there is still a significant gap between what we see today in current flows and what is needed for low carbon and climate resilient development. So looking at estimates of many very reputable organizations, we have come up with some figures that show that global estimated needs are about 5 times higher than what we have today. So that obviously is kind of a situation that's pretty challenging. We need to find the right ways, and I think it comes to your questions on what is the role of financial markets, which we obviously do think play a pivotal role in funding the transition to a decarbonized and climate resilient economy. But I think what I want to kind of just highlight here, I think the ability of financial markets to really play this important role really hinges on a confluence of factors. It's about robust policy and regulatory frameworks. So I think really that the role of governments in ensuring that there are policies that incentivize green investment, such as carbon pricing or subsidies for renewable energy, and more broadly, green investments are really pivotal, and I think that's really key. And at the same time, I think financial regulators also need to highlight the importance of information. So again, requiring disclosure of climate-related financial risks to really make sure that the various actors in the financial markets have the right incentives to move and to fill the gaps that we see. Just very briefly, I think there's a number of factors or areas within financial markets that could play a role. I think market mechanisms are important. I think it's also about expanding green bond markets. It's about special climate funds that are really vital sources for funding of sustainable projects. But I think more of that, there's a lot of additional innovative ways that we can be using in order to really kind of unlock more funding. And I think we have seen certainly over the last years the importance of public and private partnerships that really can leverage substantial capital for sustainable investments. But we obviously all know that challenges remain. There is a lot of discussions, perception, but also real risks related to these types of investments. And so I think thinking about how can we be more innovative, more effective in de risking mechanisms is really important as we are trying to really bolster the role of financial markets in this space. And maybe let me just stop here now and pass over to Maria.
Thank you, Maria. Yes, I think I thank you. That was a great introduction to the conversation. Maria, take from there.
Well, actually, Barbara made a great introduction for me to complement. I think a couple of things in terms of complementing what Barbara is saying. When we talk about needing fivefold more finance or more resources than what we have already allocated, it's also about us becoming more sophisticated to understand what we understand by finance and what we understand by investments. And particularly for our domestic markets, thinking about Brazil, for example, is we actually need to think about different types of investments and what are the types of finance available. So for the transformation we also need long-term finance. We need the resources and the financing instruments to be more adequate to the type of risks we need to take to scale up innovation, like, for example, using more nature-based solutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and so on. So when we talk about mobilizing resources, we need to think about what is the role of public finance as catalyzer. What is the role of private sector and investments, which are expected to be 70% of these resources that need to be scaled or shift, because it's not only about scaling, but also changing the way you're doing investments. But this private sector will continue operating as private sector. They have to look at risks and returns that are commercially viable for them. And so what is also the role of commercial finance versus, for example, more concessional finance or finance that is available to take risks that the private sector will not take? And on the top of that, we have domestic resources that need to be mobilized and international resources. So I think we are starting to understand that when we talk about financial systems, it's not anymore just about banking, for example. It is about banks, pension funds, capital markets. Barbara mentioned the green bonds, the potential of using all actually of the different players and the stakeholders of the financial systems, but is also to think about how we are leveraging the different types of resources and what the role of these finances sources are in terms of complementing each other to be effective. No? So coming back to development banks and their roles, I think there is an important role for these banks to be more catalytic. Barbara mentioned about de-risking. Indeed, many times what is needed is not necessarily just financing, but is to de-risk what actually some private sector may be willing to invest in, but will not be having the appetite to take the risk, no? Or to provide also value monetization to climate change positive benefits. So how do we monetize, for example, greenhouse gas emissions, and how do we promote that some positive results of these investments for the global good can also have some economic benefit? No? So there is an opportunity for the public funds to be better used for that. Private sector, again, is not the same. If we are talking to a bank or a pension fund, or if we are talking with an asset manager or using the stock exchange. So this also needs to be considered. Maybe these different sources of funds or different ways to finance need to be considered also depending on the types of projects we want to support. And so I think where we are at, as you asked in the beginning, Rogério, we are much better today than we were, like I would say 10 years ago. What Barbara is saying, we got already some traction compared to what we were before, but we need to be much, much beyond where we are. And the challenge here is not just bringing more money, is how do we work in terms of blending the money, in terms of catalyzing well the resources and combining them for the types of things we need to do to actually shift investments and change the way we do.
This was, it could not be more complementary, but let me bring something say a southern look at that, because I'm trying to grasp some the concept. Okay, I get it. I think that Barbara, being an European, I mean, she takes, of course, sometimes you take, when you finish saying, oh, we have to look more at public-private partnership, you take for granted that there's a role that has been played for many years in Europe of the public sector being a catalyzer, working as not just bringing financing and blending with the private sector, but using that money, that scarce money, as a catalyzer to crowd in private sector funding. That has been done in many places in Europe, and I believe in Austria too, but in many other places. But that's not a conversation that we normally have in the South. particularly in Brazil. I mean, we are just grasping that understanding now. And Maria is bringing that full circle when she says it's about blended finance, but also it's the role of it's the analytical role that you have the public sector can have in order to leverage more resources. Perhaps you could, I mean, you can have the conversation about this, because I think this is for Brazilians and also for international colleagues. It's good to understand that there is a gap of understanding the problem. What do you think? Do I make sense, Barbara? Not always, but I'm trying to.
Absolutely, Rogério. And I do think, I think this is like what you explain and describe, I think is something that is the general understanding that, things happen in the global north and not in the global south. Looking at data, again, which I love, is actually showing that more than 85% of all the climate finance that we can track today is raised and distributed nationally, so in a domestic context. So there is much more happening in countries than actually is well known. So I do think that it's not only in like Austria or like in European countries, but I do think there's a lot actually happening. And we do know that also by looking at like very detailed kind of mappings of climate finance flows, for example, in Brazil or in India or in Indonesia. So we know that there is a lot happening in country, and that the role of domestic governments and the regulation, everything is really important. So I think sometimes it's just that it's not that well known, or like people are not like aware of everything that is going on. But I think that it's more important than ever to really kind of share what are some of the best practices in terms of regulations, in terms of policies and incentives, or in terms of, as Maria said, like blended finance. Again, there is some really, if you look at the trends in climate finance, I think over the last 10 years, we've seen really, really good success stories and best practices on how you can blend public and private finance. How can you unlock more private finance or other pools of domestic capital? And I think it is really important to be better in sharing these best practices, sharing this knowledge, and really highlighting what can be replicated quickly, and how countries actually can set the right circumstances. You talked, obviously, talking about Brazil. Again, at CPI, we are running kind of a specific incubator and accelerator on climate finance, and we have a specific Brazil chapter there. And I'm very impressed just by the entrepreneurship and the ideas that come from Brazil on how can you use actually some very, like simple, or like not simple, like some very well-known and established financial instruments also for the climate and sustainable development space, which like the FIDICs, we have a green FIDIC instrument that we're helping to be replicated. So I think I'm very impressed by what's going on. So I think there's good signals. I think we're going in the right direction. I just feel like we're having a lot of good pilots and good success stories, but we got to think much more about how can we get to scale from those pilots, because ultimately we really need to fill a pretty big gap in this context.
Thank you, Maria. And it gives me a way of fixing something that I should have fixed. I forget to mention that, of course, nowadays you preside the Institute of Climate Society, Instituto de Clima e Sociedade. And I'm very happy that I could do that, because you have been dealing in the ECS with the issues of mobilizing resources, particularly in Brazil, with the ecological transition. Perhaps you can land this conversation and this in terms of good examples of what you've seen in Brazil to bring your perspective to the discussion.
Yeah, I think, Rogério, indeed the South perspective, it comes from some issues, like, for example, first of all, in terms of financial systems, the big difference is probably that we do have market failures that are bigger sometimes than in Europe, okay? or, for example, that the depth of our capital markets or our financial markets is not as deep or as strong as it is in other places. So, for example, when we talk about the bond market, it's not that we have little green bonds, it's that we in general don't have yet as a large bond market as you would have, for example, in US or in Europe, right? So that's important for us to take into account, that our financial system still is, for example, in the case of Brazil, highly concentrated, depending a lot on banks and banking and lending commercial terms that is very short term and not always adequate to the type of investments we need to do. So when you are talking about, let's say, the transition plan that the government is promoting and the types of opportunities we have in Brazil, to take one, Brazil is in the world the place that has the highest potential to finance restoration from degraded lands. And this restoration could actually become the highest potential in the world of removals by sinks, new removals by sinks, with Brazil with 15% of the global potential and any other country in the world being about 1%, right? So the high potential we have for that, however, requires a lot of innovation in terms of finance, because not always these resources are, let's say, truly easy to implement. Restoration per se may not have a full economic benefit. We can have productive restoration with, let's say, some benefits like cacao beans or biofuels and so on, but it may not be completely always economically viable per se. So we would need to have this kind of regulatory signals. Are we allowing, for example, to give some carbon pricing, be it in the way of giving carbon credits or payments for environmental services? Are we having some kind of way to resolve the problem that these investments in forests, for example, may take 5, 6, sometimes 7 years to produce a result, meaning that the first years are years of insecurity and no return? So it's a long-term finance and payback. How we manage this, how we handle the issue that most of the people who do these projects in restoration may have a high capex at the beginning to do the investments on natural seeds and locally considering local resources and local types of species that are expensive and not that simple to plant. So how do we handle all these risks, right, with the financial innovation? And how we scale that? And that, again, is where we need to think better how we can use, for example, rightly, better the public finance from development banks for maybe addressing some of these risks and the performance of the project at the end, because everything is based on the expectation at the end of either selling the cacao beans or either selling the biofuel or either selling the carbon credits or the combination of thereof. And at the same time, how to manage the risks during the implementation of the project until it gets the benefit, and considering that, again, maybe our commercial system is not going to be giving finance for 7 years. So I think this is the kind of issues that we need to tackle structurally, to think about what private sector needs to be able to be willing to engage in investments for so many years, what kind of certainty we need to give on the off-taking, right, of those projects, and how I, as public bank, for example, have the right set of financial instruments to incentivize that. And requires indeed regulation, as Barbara was saying, because if you have some certainty about the carbon price or some environmental service that payment that's very clear, with a clear price as well, or if I have certainty also on how I'm structuring these projects and being incentivized to do them, be it for productive reasons, it helps a lot already private sector to engage. But you still have probably for some of those more innovative cases need for concessional finance. And that is the question, how we use best the concessional finance from the public banks. So just to give here a concrete example, I think the restoration is a very interesting one. That, of course, is a specific opportunity in Brazil that may need also for solutions, as Barbara was saying, innovative solutions from Brazil.
Okay. Actually, we managed to cover a significant part of the other questions, but let me introduce here a little twist to this conversation. It's very being a Brazilian and also having some experience with advising and working in countries of the South. Uh, it's always strikes me that what Maria has said. I mean, the capital markets are shallow. We have a risk manager and we have very high interest rates. We had scarce fiscal resources and so on. So the South has got to put all this together. And Barbara said 85% of all the mobilization is domestic in the world, but also is very badly distributed. If you look, I mean, developing countries, if you exclude China, using your own data, Barbara, you know that the mobilization capacity of the Southern economy is very low. So you have at the same time to work on developing the national capital markets, bring a different perspective of how the public sector can work and mobilize resources at a scale that is even more significant in terms of GDP than in many developing economies. How can international cooperation, how can international partnership help in accelerating that? Do you see from your two perspectives what could be done for international partners to help the southern countries to move as fast as they need to move? Barbara.
Great question. I think ultimately it is about empowering countries. I think it is about ensuring that there is country-led leadership, basically. So I think international cooperation needs to change from thinking about how can you transfer resources from the north to the south to how can you enable and empower countries themselves. So I do think, and I know the G20 and again with Maria's support, has been thinking a lot about country platforms. I do think that there is a real opportunity and a need to build the capacity in country to really ensure that there is the right capacity to both kind of source and invest and receive funding in country. So for me, I think one of the most important things to do is really kind of how can you really boost this? How can you boost domestic markets? How can you bolster domestic markets? What can you do to really make sure that there's the right capacity in country? Again, just coming back to the data, which I love, is that not only is that 85% of global climate finance is raised and spent domestically, but about out of the overarching numbers that we are able to track, the 1.3 trillion development finance institutions, like the really kind of the institutions that understand the market context, provides the majority of public finance. It's almost 60% of public finance and almost 30% of total climate finance that is provided by development finance institutions. And within that, national development finance institutions play a particularly important role there. They contribute almost $240 billion of the 1.3 trillion. So it is really important to continue to build the capacity in country. These types of institutions, the national institutions, really understand the market context. They have the networks. They understand how to engage with the private sector. So I think what needs to happen on the international, global level is just to really ensure more of the capacity building of the empowerment of the country-led strategies and the institutions that are domestic. So I think that's, for me, the most important part.
Thank you. How about you, Maria? What do you think?
I agree with Barbara. I think that the important, when we talk about international role, when we talk about multilateral development banks and also philanthropies and other players, even private investors, international, it's very important to first understand what is the local ecosystem, what are the local needs, and that is something that needs to be done preferably locally and has to be coordinated on a bottom-up approach. I mean, traditionally, a lot of those finance and programs have been a bit top-down. So moving to a more coordinated approach in allowing, for example, for different sources of finance to be better aligned and coordinated instead of duplicating, and also be able to dialogue with institutions like local DFIs and local players, also private sector and governments, to understand what they really want is important. And the idea of country platforms is a lot about that. It's about being able to coordinate better how I'm going to mobilize resources and combine them. I think also multilateral development banks have a huge important role to reduce the cost of capital. A lot of times when we are talking about developing countries, they are already perceived upfront, independent of what you are going to invest in, as high risk because of country political risk or whatever kind of definition of risk you want to make. And I think multilateral development banks should have an important role to help to reduce the risk for attracting capital and developing and supporting also this kind of financial innovation that sometimes is difficult even for the national instruments to do because of sometimes even our regulations not being so sophisticated. So I think this role on de-risking and reducing the cost of access to capital is important. And I think also it's extremely important to support the ecosystem building, which is these country platforms, but also, as Barbara was talking in the beginning, the regulations, the kinds of incentives that need to be there for the investments to flow. And obviously, there is a lot of opportunity for us nationally to learn how other countries and other places have dealt with that. And that's what we were talking at the beginning. And clearly, philanthropies and UN itself and multilateral development banks have opportunity to allow this kind of conversation for us to understand. And lots of the experience I had in my life, sometimes the most productive examples were when you had, for example, a development bank in Brazil, seeing what the development bank in Mexico were doing and learn from each other. Sometimes it's much better even than a multilateral bank to tell to these banks what they should do. So I believe also on this ecosystem building being an important kind of work, and the learning from each other also being as a good opportunity to leverage also the national experience.
Well, this is so interesting. Let me ask you this. I had to ask you a question about the trends. What is catching your attention now in terms of trends of actors and markets? But I do not want to miss this conversation about national and internet and multilateral development banks learning from each other. So, but I'll try to stick to the question that I would like to ask, which is strengths. Okay, from your two perspective, if you can be very brief, what are you looking at that you say, oh, this is interesting, this is moving in an interesting way nowadays? Which actors and markets do you see as more promising nowadays? Barbara.
Yeah, trends. Again, I think good trends, there is much more attention to climate finance. Again, we've seen this pretty big increases in climate finance from across, different actors, which I think is positive. I think this increased understanding of the need to use public finance to unlock other pools of capital, private capital, use concessional finance, as Maria said, more effectively. I think that is something that is positive to me. There is this trend, again, also evidenced in the G20 working groups that, how can you better streamline, harmonize access to some of the concessional funding through the funds that are out there, like the Green Climate Fund and the Climate Investment Funds and others. So I think that is positive. I think maybe one of the most interesting trends to me is actually finally seeing the insurance industry getting more involved, and then not just in their, kind of reactive way, but really thinking more on what they can do to come into, using the tool sets that they have to really address climate risks and be more proactive in this area. So I think that is, for me, a really, really interesting trend. But and I think the one other trend that I'm seeing, even though it's still kind of in its initial steps, is we see a lot of most of the finance going towards mitigation, which is energy, renewable energy, energy efficiency, etc. But I do see some more interest, even from the private sector, in adaptation resilience. So I think that is something to me that is important, and that I think needs to be bolstered much more, because we have a huge gap in adaptation finance. So I think that's something that needs to happen more. And so maybe I leave it with that. Maybe just final point. I also see a lot of interest in domestic carbon markets, which again for me is an important part of the overall solution. And we just got to make sure that they're high integrity and everything. But I think this is a good trend as well, because again, we need, I think, all the tools that we have in order to make some more progress.
Thank you. Maria.
Well, from a perspective from Brazil, thinking a bit on the same way as Barbara, but looking first at a very big level, unfortunately, even because we had these big disasters with Rio Grande do Sul, there is a conscience, I think, increasingly that is bringing the conversation about how we cost the impact of climate, or the inaction that may lead to more costs of having to respond to disasters if I don't have any preparedness. No, this triggering down is bringing in Brazil, in fact, actually a conversation about, for instance, the role of insurance, the role of needing to be better able to parameterize our risks, and how eventually, I think in the long term, there will be a big conversation, more frank, about also how we are doing economic or investment valuation, thinking about these scenarios and risks, which is currently not the case. No? So rating agencies today are using it are acting or advising and giving ratings based on actually historical risks. And a lot of the decisions that are made on investments and so on also, and I think we know this is not anymore possible. It's important to look at these scenarios and also give some value positively when the project, the activity, the investment is integrating these risks and managing them. So I think this is a new area that is taking up an important role in conversation, and I see as a global trend as well, on questioning also the role of rating agencies, how we are giving premium to those who are managing these risks, and also the reality that these risks need to be accounted for and considered. And there's a bit what Barbara was saying about adaptation, as well. The other thing I think in terms of trends is also to think about in Brazil, who are the first runners supporting the climate and green finance. I think the capital markets played an important role in Brazil on the green finance, and that's interesting. I mean, we have a shallow capital market, but our capital market was very important in terms of promoting the green bonds, but also asset managers today, in my view, are the ones that are innovating the most with investment funds and so on, particularly on these nature-based solution projects that are still small to the scale that is needed, but a lot of the innovation is coming from this side. So I think it's interesting to see the capital markets in Brazil playing this role beyond just the traditional banking institutions that tend to be obviously more conservative and less innovative. So I think that is an interesting trend to see also in Brazil. And then what Barbara was saying, I think the whole idea of commodities, green commodities, including carbon markets, but I think there is also in the long term a push for valuation also on what's going to be the footprinting of commodities value chains. Maybe that's not as obvious today, but we are seeing more and more large corporates pushing for their, let's say, what we call scope 3, but basically is those that are producing and being the ones that are in the value chain of these larger companies, to actually force those value chains to have to also demonstrate their alignment in terms of greenhouse gases emissions and how they are reducing emissions. So I think this trend is going to become more and more strong, and in a way will also have to be internalized by the financial systems in terms of valuing things. Finally, I think in Brazil is important that there is some signals from the finance ministry and the central bank and the Value Commission, in particular the fact that we are finally developing a Brazilian green taxonomy is important to give some clarity on how we define green in Brazil, and it's natural that some things need to be adapted to our own reality, because we do have, for example, in Brazil, much more reliance in land use change and so on than, for example, the European countries where the green taxonomy maybe have been more focused on infrastructure, energy, and so on. So it's important to see this taxonomy and this kind of market signals coming up as well, including the financial regulation as well, bringing to Brazil the latest trends of ISSB and so on. So I think this is another important trend that is only starting and should have some impact, I hope, in the long term in our financial markets.
Yeah, it's all very interesting, and I wish we could have another 2 hours to have this discussion, because basically what Yuichiro is saying, Barbara is saying, we are now seeing finally very clearly the role of public sector in helping and catalyzing the private sector to come in. Because some of the risks, as Maria said, some of the risks are pretty new. It's not risk, it's uncertainty. And he also mentioned, for instance, the insurance companies are coming on board. And that makes sense, because the insurance companies are being very badly hit by extreme climate events. They're losing, of course, not like other people that have been directly, but financially they have been affected by it. So there is a trend that is a mixture of market-led consequences of climate change, but also awareness of the role of the actors can have. So I wish we could have a longer conversation about this, but let me try to ask you something about what you both have said in terms of national, multilateral, and regional development banks working more together, learning more from each other, and also exchanging and working as platforms in order to catalyze the work. Can you give me your view nowadays, what that cooperation between DFIs could be, and how can, like, the G20 and other fora, international fora, can push for that happening? Barbara, please.
Sure. And again, I think that is something having started CPI like 15 years ago, I think from the very beginning, we did see the crucial role of development finance institutions. And I think I've seen over the last decade, particularly, really important collaborations emerging and evolving. Started with the group of the multilateral development banks, which is still really important. And again, Maria played a very important role there. Maria played a very important role also in kind of fostering the overall ecosystem of multilateral and national development banks in Latin America. And I think I've seen that also evolve over the years. So really very strong connections between the MDBs and national development banks. But there is, various clubs at the moment. And I think just maybe, as we don't have that much time, for me, the most promising development over the last years has been this finance in common development. So really bringing together all the public development banks and trying to enable them to share knowledge. There is a number of initiatives. We're involved in one of them, the Finance in Common System Lab, this IDB, where we're trying to help foster knowledge exchange between banks and really make sure that banks can learn from each other and really help in this way scale and replicate what works. So I think, again, for me, development banks just play a crucial role in filling the existing funding gaps and fostering some of the innovative ways to attract also additional patient funding for the transition to a sustainable future. And they've shown that over the last decade for sure, and they have the right connections. They understand the market context. I think their unique position just allows them to leverage resources, mitigate risks, as we discussed, and also catalyze private investment in many ways. So for me, kind of continuing to build and then like strengthen that ecosystem of public development banks, I think is really important. So hopefully the Finance in Common Secretariat will be able to kind of continue this I think very important work to work with the group of the MDBs, to work with the group of the also the development finance institutions, the IDFC and others, just to really make sure that these institutions can further grow and enable change in their countries.
Thank you. Maria.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think the Financing Common indeed is a very interesting example to demonstrate we actually have over the world over 500 public development banks, and that, they actually have assets over, I don't know how many trillions, so they do have a very important role to play already nationally and in terms of catalyzation. When you ask how the national banks can work better, the public banks with the global banks, I think there are a lot of different opportunities. First of all, the MDBs can actually be a catalyzer precisely of changes that sometimes the local banks cannot do alone, be it because of regulation or because they don't have access to some of the innovation that is possible, particularly from the financial structuring. So, for example, just to give an example, in Latin America, a lot of the initial green bonds that were issued were actually from national development banks. They had a huge role to develop the local capital markets because they were the first institutions to issue their own bonds. No? But their own bonds, frankly, benefited a lot from the experience they had in doing lending with multilateral banks in the past that helped them to develop pipelines, KPIs, and structures for financing green bank projects. No, so that was, for example, the example of the first ever green bond in the region that was NAFIN. I know for SA because I was used to be in IDB. We helped it to develop their pipeline on renewable energy, thanks to climate finance, thanks to IDB, thanks to the World Bank. So it was very interesting because that's an example, beautiful example on how multilaterals, climate finance, were able to develop the capacity of NAFIN to become a huge tractor at the time of all the seed money that really scaled at the time, renewables in NAFIN, in Mexico. And then NAFIN was issuing a bond for financing more renewables. But, so I think there is a lot of things like that make a lot of sense that don't need to be always just necessarily the financing. Is about really the experience of working together in developing capacities and exchanging. At the same time, obviously, multilaterals have, and I think on the challenges we're talking on the country platforms, sometimes every multilateral is coming with a different condition, a different term sheet. If I was going to be provoking towards the future, this whole conversation on the G20, on the reform of the multilaterals, among them could be to become more aligned and better connected and more complementary, because naturally every multilateral bank, frankly, have a different logic. So IDB is kind of a cooperative of Latin American countries plus US and some other countries in the world with very small shares, right? World Bank is a bank with an old-fashioned kind of vision with the North and South very market. We have banks like the Asian Infrastructure Bank that has a different infrastructure and is also global today. We have the BRICS Bank, the new development banks. We have the CAF. We have different multilaterals with completely different mandates. Still, they should be better aligned because it's important that, for example, a country like Brazil can use these different multilaterals in a way that is complementary, and preferably that not each of them come with completely different conditions and ways to actually access or give money. Else, it becomes very complex. And I think maybe for Brazil is maybe a bit less of a problem, but if you take a smaller country, it becomes even more complex, because it's very costly to be, for example, financing a big infrastructure, but then every multilateral has a different condition for safeguards, for example. So I think there's a lot of opportunity on the relationship of DFIs and multilaterals, also in simplifying and helping the dialogue on how could you channel these resources in a way that is more coordinated. And I think the DFIs, when we see the case of Brazil with BNDES, which is a very emblematic national development bank, can play an important role as being one of the largest, let's say, recipients sometimes of those different multilaterals, being able to become also a player to dialogue better on how this relationship and this complementarity can be improved. And I think this bottom-up conversation with the country platforms is important, not to have only governments leading these platforms. But having the national development banks, having the DFIs as a very important part of these platforms as well, when we talk about the country ownership, because it's not only about the government priorities, it's also about how you do it, how you channel the resources, what does it work. And the DFIs tend to know much better what is the local market than necessarily a ministry. So I think this is also an important message.
Yeah, and also they not only they know much more the market, but they have a connection with policymakers, so they can make the adjustments that, for instance, in terms of regulation that Barbara was saying, because they are at the same time bankers, but they're advisors of governments, right? And they have a connections to the capital market. This is so incredible. I think we have covered most of the issues, and I probably missed a lot. I know we should have had a 2 hours conversation here, but let me ask you: would you like to? I have to make a formal closing here. Okay, this is required. But would you like to give a last goal, say something that you wanted to say but you could not say because Rogério did not stop talking? So please go ahead. Barbara, start there, and I give the floor to Maria afterwards.
Thank you so much, Rogério. No, and I think that was a great conversation. So I really enjoyed that. So thanks again for having me. I think the one point I just want to, no, I think I have 2 points. One is really the importance of national, local financial institutions. I think this will help us really scale climate action. And again, it doesn't necessarily need to be climate. I think we need to think much more about how can we combine and align development and climate. So the really important role of national and subnational financial institutions in helping us align development and finance. And the second is I really would love to start thinking more about the quality of climate or development finance instead of the quantity. I think we really need to think much more about the impact that investments and policies have, instead of just like looking always at how much are we spending. I think that will really help us then also more nuance and help scale some of the actions that are most impactful. So I think these are my 2 points.
Thank you, Barbara. Maria.
Maybe on a more philosophical way, but I think one thing for me is important to recognize is, with all the problems we have in the world today, fragmentation, conflicts, a lot of problems with the value chains, global crises over sectors like energy that are so important for addressing climate change, I do think there is a huge opportunity and momentum for a conversation on how climate change is relevant and completely part of development pathways. Sometimes we keep thinking about environment as something completely separated from development, and people think about climate just as hugging a tree. It's not about that. It's actually about everything we do. Is emissions, is about how we adapt to these climate changes that are already happening, is about almost all the sectors in our economy and how we integrate this in the way we do things. But it's also a huge opportunity. And now thinking about from Brazil, we have an opportunity that we should use much better in terms of positioning ourselves and our economy with that. And thinking about climate finance as an enabler for us to develop better, to make it inclusion, in having a development benefit in terms of creating jobs and opportunities, is something we need still to do. And I think we need to have a much better narrative about that, because that's the case, and we are not being able to grasp it as we should. It's not only about minorities, it's about everybody. It's an opportunity for Brazil in particular, because we do have a lot of nature resources. We do have a lot of opportunities also for actually growing, innovating, having new technologies. We do have an opportunity to become more productive with this type of investments. And we do, of course, with that also have an opportunity to create jobs and integration and inclusion. So that, for me, would be my final message, because when we talk about development banks or multilateral development banks or climate finance, for me, climate finance is also about development finance. And that's why we're talking about these banks, because development should not be separated from climate. And unfortunately, I think very often that seems to be the narrative, and it may lead us to the wrong place.
If we had rehearsed for this, I could not have landed this conversation better than what you have just, you both of you have just said. So I'm very grateful. Let me read the formal closing here before. Thank you. This podcast is a product of the project Enhancing Resources Mobilization for Sustainable Investment through MDB's partnership with National Development Banks. And it is a partnership between the Brazilian Center of International Relations and the Center of Global Development. We're going to have 6 episodes. This is the second one. I could not more be happier with the conversation we just had. I want to thank the incredible experts that we have in front of us, but also friends, and hoping that it does not only give me hope about the future, but gives everybody else that is watching this more hope about the future. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Maria. And yes.
Thank you so much. Nice to see you.
Very nice. Obrigada.
Thank you. Bye. Ciao, ciao.